Alright, so I need to get this out. It's been a few years, but it's one of those things that just sticks to you. Like tar. This story isn't mine, not really. It belongs to an old friend of mine from nursing school, Claire. We were catching up over coffee a while ago and she told me everything. I'm going to try and tell it exactly the way she told me, because the details are what make it so unsettling. Her story starts on her very first night shift at a place called Clear Creek Senior Living. You know the kind of place. A nice, clean, well-lit facility on the edge of a quiet suburban town. It was the kind of job you take when you're fresh out of school, full of energy and a slightly naive desire to make a difference. For Claire, it was mostly about getting experience and paying off her student loans. She told me the first few hours were exactly what you'd expect. Boring, almost painfully so. The silence in a nursing home after 10 p.m. is a special kind of silence. It's not empty, it's filled with the low, steady hum of the HVAC system, the rhythmic, electronic beep, 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 of a dozen different heart monitors, and the occasional, dry, papery cough from a room down the hall. It's a silence that's supposed to feel peaceful, safe, a manufactured tranquility. Claire's shift started with rounds. She walked the long, linoleum-tiled hallways, her rubber-soled shoes making soft, squeaking sounds that seemed way too loud in the stillness. The lights were dimmed to a soft, golden glow, casting long, gentle shadows that stretched from doorways and furniture. She'd peek into each room, a smile ready in case anyone was awake. Most were sound asleep, their chests rising and falling in shallow, even breaths. Mr. Henderson in 112, a retired mailman, always slept with his mouth wide open. Mrs. Gable in 115, a former librarian, had her hands folded neatly on top of her blanket, as if in prayer. It was all routine, normal. She checked the charts at the nurses' station, a small island of bright, sterile light in the middle of the main hall. She refilled water pitchers. She organized medication carts for the morning shift. She was doing everything by the book, feeling that little buzz of satisfaction that comes from being competent and in control. The night was uneventful, and she was almost disappointed by how much it felt like a practice run instead of the real thing. She even sent a text to her boyfriend, first night shift. So far, so good. Mostly just fighting to stay awake. Lol. He texted back a sleepy face emoji. She smiled, put her phone down, and settled in with a textbook she'd brought. The quiet wrapped around her again. Beep, beep, hum, cough. It was almost 2 a.m. when the silence was broken. It was a single, piercing chime. Beep. It wasn't an emergency alarm. It was a call button. The light on the main console lit up. Room 204. The sound echoed down the empty hall, sharp and demanding. Claire's heart gave a little jump, more from the sudden noise than anything else. Room 204. She quickly checked the chart. Mrs. Adeline Walker, 87 years old, severe Alzheimer's, sundowning syndrome. The notes were filled with the usual observations. Episodes of confusion, memory loss, occasional agitation. A textbook case. Claire stood up, her joints popping softly. Okay, Mrs. Adeline, she murmured to herself, let's see what you need. She walked down the hallway to the B-wing, her footsteps the only sound again. The door to 204 was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of hallway light cutting into the darkness within. She pushed it open gently. Mrs. Adeline, she called softly. It's Claire, the nurse. You rang? The room was dark, save for the faint green glow of a digital clock on the bedside table. The air was still and smelled faintly of baby powder. As her eyes adjusted, she saw her. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. Patients with Alzheimer's, especially as advanced as Mrs. Adeline's, tend to have a certain posture. A slump, a sort of physical manifestation of the fog in their minds. But Mrs. Adeline was sitting bolt upright in her bed. Her thin, white hair was a halo in the dim light. She wasn't slumped at all. She was sitting with a strange, rigid alertness. But it was her eyes that really got to Claire. Usually they were clouded, distant, looking at something a million miles away. Tonight, they were clear. Chillingly clear. They were fixed, not on Claire, but on the far corner of the room. A corner shrouded in a thick, impenetrable darkness where the hallway light couldn't reach. Mrs. Adeline? Claire said again, taking a step inside. Are you all right? Do you need some water? Help to the bathroom? The old woman didn't look at her. She slowly, deliberately, raised a trembling, bony hand and pointed toward the dark corner. Her voice, when it came, wasn't the usual weak, garbled mumble. It was raspy, yes, but it was also perfectly clear. Precise. Nurse, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room. Have you fed the man in the corner his dinner yet? Claire froze for a half second. A chill, slick and cold, slid down her spine. It was the clarity that did it. The absolute certainty in that question. She'd been trained for this, of course. Hallucinations were common. You don't argue, you don't challenge. You reassure and redirect. She forced a calm, professional smile onto her face. A man in the corner, sweetie? There's no man here, it's just you and me. She walked over to the corner, her training kicking in. You validate their reality without confirming the delusion. She made a show of looking. To be thorough and maybe to reassure herself more than the patient, she pulled out her phone and switched on the flashlight. The bright, white beam cut through the gloom, illuminating nothing. Just a plain, beige wall meeting another plain, beige wall. An empty armchair, a small dust bunny shivering in the draft from under the door. Nothing. She turned the light off and turned back to Mrs. Adeline. See? All clear. It was probably just a shadow, honey. Sometimes the light plays tricks on our eyes. Mrs. Adeline's gaze didn't waver from the corner. Her hand was still pointing. He gets very hungry, she insisted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You mustn't forget him. Okay, I won't, Claire said soothingly, walking over to the bed and gently taking the old woman's hand. It was cold as ice. You try and get some rest now, all right? I'll make sure everyone gets fed. The word felt strange and heavy in her mouth. She fluffed Mrs. Adeline's pillow and helped her lie back down. The woman complied, but her eyes, wide and lucid, remained locked on that dark corner of the room. It was unnerving. Claire had dealt with dementia patients for months during her clinicals, but she'd never seen a moment of lucidity this intense. This focused. It didn't feel like a hallucination born of a confused mind. It felt like a warning from a sane one. Shaking the thought off as first-night jitters, she gave Mrs. Adeline's hand a final reassuring squeeze and walked to the door. I'll be right at the station if you need anything else, she said, her voice bright and a little too loud. She pulled the door toward her, leaving just a small crack open, as was policy. She stood in the hallway for a moment, the manufactured quiet of the building rushing back in to fill the space. She took a deep breath, telling herself it was just the disease. It was just a textbook symptom. Nothing more. As she gently pushed the door until it was almost closed, just before the latch clicked shut, she heard it. It was so faint she almost missed it, so quiet it was barely more than a breath of air. A dry, rasping whisper from inside the room. It wasn't directed at her. It wasn't a call for help. It sounded like a statement of fact, whispered into the darkness. Hungry? So Claire backed out of the room, pulling the heavy wooden door almost shut, just like she was supposed to. She told me her hand was shaking a little as she did it. That last, faint whisper from Mrs. Adeline, _hungry_, it got under her skin. She stood there in the quiet hallway for a long moment, the low hum of the building's ventilation system suddenly seeming very loud. She took a breath, and then another. It's the Alzheimer's, she told herself. It's sundowning. This is what it looks like. This is the job. She walked back to the nurse's station, her footsteps making soft, squeaking sounds on the polished linoleum. The station was this little island of clean, white, fluorescent light in the middle of the dim, sleeping wing. It was supposed to be a safe zone, her command center, but sitting back down in the squeaky office chair, the feeling of safety was gone. It felt less like an island and more like a raft in a very large, very dark ocean. She tried to get back to her textbook. It was some dense chapter on pharmacological interactions in geriatric patients. Usually, she could lose herself in stuff like that. The neat, orderly world of facts and figures was a comfort. But tonight, the words just weren't sticking. They were just black marks on a white page. Her eyes kept drifting up from the book, scanning the bank of security monitors. They showed the empty hallways, the deserted common room, the main entrance. Everything still, lifeless, normal, but her mind kept replaying the scene in room 204. It wasn't the hallucination itself that bothered her. She'd seen patients talk to people who weren't there a dozen times during her training. It was the _clarity_, the sheer, jarring lucidity in Mrs. Adeline's eyes. When someone is deep in dementia, their mind is like a staticky TV, and moments of clarity are like the image suddenly coming into perfect focus for a second before dissolving back into snow. This had felt like that. A moment of pure, sharp focus. And in that moment, she wasn't confused. She was afraid, and she was issuing a warning. Claire shook her head, physically trying to dislodge the thought. "You're tired," she told herself. "First night shift. Your brain is playing tricks on you. The quiet is making you jumpy." She picked up a patient chart and tried to focus on the notes, on the clean lines of the forms, the precise medical terminology. Anything to ground her in reality. Vitals stable, fluid intake normal, bowel movement noted, the mundane, boring rhythm of care. The clock on the wall ticked. Each second felt loud, deliberate. Tick, tock. The sound echoed the steady, metronomic beeping from the heart monitors down the hall. Beep, beep. It was a chorus of quiet machinery, the sound of a building full of people being kept alive. A thought, ugly and unwanted, slithered into her head. All this machinery, all this quiet, it felt like the whole place was just holding its breath. She managed to make about 45 minutes pass like that. 45 minutes of pretending to work, of rereading the same paragraph in her textbook over and over, of her heart giving a little lurch every time a floorboard creaked or the ice machine down the hall dropped a new batch with a loud clatter. She was starting to feel a little foolish, jumpy over a textbook case of sundowning. She was just about to convince herself that she'd overreacted, that it was all in her head, when the call light on the main console lit up again. It wasn't a single, polite chime this time. It was a frantic, desperate shrieking. Beep, 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 one after another, without a pause. The red light for room 204 was flashing like a strobe. Claire told me her blood ran cold. That's a cliché, I know, but she said she could literally feel the warmth drain from her face. That wasn't a call for water. That wasn't someone who needed help to the bathroom. That was the sound of panic. She was out of her chair in a second, not even grabbing a chart, just moving. Her professional calm shattered, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She half walked, half jogged down the B-wing corridor, the hallway seeming to stretch out in front of her, longer and darker than it had been before. The soft glow from the wall sconces cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and dance at the edge of her vision. Every doorway she passed felt like a dark, gaping mouth. She reached room 204 and pushed the door open without knocking. Mrs. Adeline? The scene inside made her stop dead in the doorway. Mrs. Adeline wasn't in her bed. She was huddled on the floor, pressed into the corner opposite the one she'd pointed at before. She had dragged her thin blanket with her and was wrapped in it like a child hiding from a monster. Her body was racked with violent tremors, her thin, frail shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes, wide and white with terror, were locked on that same empty corner of the room. The one with the armchair. When she saw Claire in the doorway, she didn't seem relieved. She just seemed more frantic. She scrambled to her knees, her voice a ragged, breathless gasp. "It's so hungry," she cried, her voice cracking with terror. She wasn't pointing anymore. Now she was gesticulating wildly at the empty space, as if trying to physically push Claire away from it. "It's been watching you. It's looking right at you now. Don't just stand there. Get out. It's looking right at you now. The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, and suddenly very, very cold. All the hairs on her arms and the back of her neck stood straight up. Her training, her rational mind, everything was screaming at her that this was a delusion, a fear response from a sick old woman. But every primal instinct in her body was screaming something else. It was screaming, she's not wrong, Against her better judgment, Claire's eyes were drawn, as if by a magnet, to the corner. The armchair was still there. The wall was still beige. But something was different. She couldn't explain it, not in any logical way. She told me it was like the darkness in that specific corner wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was deeper, thicker. Where the shadows in the rest of the room were just a lack of light, this patch of darkness felt like a substance. It seemed to bend the light around it, to swallow it. The edges of the armchair seemed fuzzy, indistinct, as if they were being dissolved. The darkness there didn't have a texture or a shape, but it had a weight. A palpable, heavy presence that seemed to press down on the very air in the room. Claire felt a wave of vertigo, as if she were staring into a deep, open well. It wasn't empty. An empty space doesn't make you feel like it's staring back. "Claire!" Mrs. Adeline shrieked, her voice pulling Claire's gaze away from the corner. "It's smiling." Claire snapped back to reality. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. She had to get Mrs. Adeline back into bed. She had to calm her down. That was her job. She took a tentative step into the room, forcing her legs to move. "It's okay, Adeline," she said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy in her ears. "It's okay, let's get you back into bed. There's nothing there." Even as she said the words, they felt like a lie. A stupid, flimsy lie. She moved towards the old woman, deliberately keeping her back to the corner. She couldn't look at it again. She was afraid of what she might see if she stared too long. She knelt and put her hands on Mrs. Adeline's trembling arms. The old woman's skin was like ice. "He knows your name," Mrs. Adeline whispered, her eyes crazed, looking past Claire's shoulder. "I heard him say it. That was it. That was the breaking point. Professionalism be damned." Claire pulled the old woman to her feet. Mrs. Adeline was surprisingly light. With a strength born of pure fear, Claire half lifted, half dragged her back across the room and helped her tumble into bed. "You stay here," Claire said, her voice a harsh whisper. "Don't get out of bed again. Do you understand?" Mrs. Adeline just whimpered, pulling the covers up to her nose, her terrified eyes still fixed on that sucking void in the corner. Claire backed away from the bed, her eyes darting between the frightened woman and the corner. She didn't turn her back to it again. She backed out of the room, fumbling for the doorknob behind her, her gaze locked on that patch of unnatural darkness. It didn't move, it didn't change, but she had the suffocating certainty that it was aware of her. That it was watching her leave. She slipped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut, and this time she didn't leave it ajar. She pushed it until she heard the definitive, solid click of the latch engaging. The sound was comforting, but not nearly comforting enough. She stood there for a second, her back pressed against the cool wood of the door, her chest heaving. She needed to breathe. She took a deep, shuddering gasp of the hallway air, trying to slow her racing pulse. The building was silent again. The emergency was over. Mrs. Adeline was back in bed. It was in that moment of forced calm, as she turned to walk away from the door, that she felt it. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a sudden, sharp, intense iciness on the back of her neck, just below her hairline. It was a focused cold, no bigger than the palm of a hand, as if someone had just leaned in close behind her and exhaled a long, slow breath. Claire froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The hallway was empty. The door to room 204 was closed and latched. The air conditioning vents were silent. There was no source for a draft. There was no reason for that feeling. And yet, she'd felt it. She didn't run. She wanted to, but she forced herself to walk, one deliberate foot in front of the other, away from room 204 and back toward the little island of light that no longer felt safe at all. She didn't look back. She was too afraid to see if a sliver of that deep, possessive darkness had managed to leak out from under the door. I didn't run. I want to make that clear. Part of me, the lizard brain part that lives in the back of your skull and is only concerned with survival, was screaming at me to turn and bolt for the main entrance. But I couldn't. I was the only nurse on this floor. Running wasn't in the job description. So I walked. I forced myself to walk, one foot in front of the other, down that long, dim hallway. The sound of my own rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the linoleum sounded obscenely loud in the quiet. I didn't look back. I was terrified that if I did, I'd see the door to room 204 hanging open, with that thick, oily darkness spilling out into the hall. The feeling of that cold breath on my neck didn't fade. It lingered, a phantom touch, a patch of icy numbness just below my hairline. I told myself it was a draft from the air conditioning vent, a freak pocket of cold air that just happened to hit me as I turned. But I'm a terrible liar, especially to myself. The vents were silent. The air in the building was still and recycled, holding the faint, antiseptic smell of cleaner and old paper. There was no draft. I knew it. I made it back to the little island of fluorescent light that was the nurse's station. It didn't feel like a safe harbor anymore. It felt like a target. A brightly lit stage in the middle of a vast, dark theater. I sank into the squeaky office chair, my legs suddenly feeling like they were filled with wet sand. My hands were shaking. I clasped them together on the clean white countertop to try and make them stop. They didn't. I could feel my own pulse thrumming in my thumbs, fast and shallow. Okay, Claire, think. This is what I told myself. You have a patient, Mrs. Adeline, who is having a severe, paranoid delusion. That's all. The darkness in the corner? A trick of the light, your tired eyes playing games. The cold spot on your neck? A psychosomatic response to fear. Your own brain creating a physical sensation to match your emotional state. It all made sense. It was all textbook, except it didn't feel like a textbook. It felt real. I picked up the phone. I needed to hear another human voice. Just to ground myself, I punched in the extension for the C-Wing nurses station, where another nurse, Brenda, was on shift. She was a veteran, been working nights here for 20 years. She'd probably laugh this whole thing off, tell me a story about a patient who thought he was Napoleon, and I'd feel foolish and everything would go back to normal. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. I let it go for a full minute, the piercing electronic beep echoing in the silent station. No answer. She must be on her rounds, or in the bathroom. That was a perfectly normal explanation. But tonight, normal explanations felt thin, like cheap fabric you could see right through. I hung up the phone, and the silence that rushed back in felt heavier than before. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but the clock on the wall told me it had only been about 10 minutes. I tried to read my pharmacology textbook again, but the words just swam in front of my eyes. My hearing felt dialed up to 11. Every tiny creak of the old building, every clank from the ancient ice machine down the hall, made me jump. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitors, scanning the empty hallways. Hallway A empty, the common room, empty, the B-wing corridor, the long, straight shot that led to room 204. Empty, still, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't loud, in fact, it was so quiet that at first, I thought I was imagining it. It was a sound that didn't belong. A soft, rhythmic scrape. It was coming from down the B-wing hall. Shush, thunk, a pause, shush, thunk. It was a dragging sound. Heavy, wet. My first thought was maybe it was one of the janitors with a floor buffer, but no one was scheduled for cleaning at this hour. My next thought was one of the residents, maybe someone had fallen out of bed and was trying to crawl for help. My professional training kicked back in, overriding the fear just enough to get me out of my chair. I grabbed the big, heavy-duty maglite from the drawer. It's supposed to be for power outages, but at that moment, its weight in my hand felt reassuring. It felt like a club. A flimsy one, but still. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding small. Is someone there? No answer. Just that same, awful sound. Shush. Thunk. It had stopped moving. It was just waiting. I stepped out from behind the station, my heart hammering against my ribs. I held the flashlight out in front of me like a talisman and swept its bright, clean beam down the B-wing corridor. The light cut a perfect circle through the gloom, illuminating the polished floor, the beige walls, the closed doors. Everything looked normal, lifeless. I took a step, then another. The beam danced ahead of me. I swept it from side to side. Left wall, nothing. Right wall, nothing. Floor. The light froze. There, on the gleaming linoleum tiles, starting right in front of the door to room 204, was something that made the cold dread from earlier feel like a fond memory. It was a set of marks. Scratches. I walked closer, my breathing hitched in my throat. I crouched down, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. They weren't random scuffs from a cart or a shoe. There were 5 of them. 5 long, parallel gouges dug deep into the floor. They were maybe a foot long, and they looked fresh. The edges of the gouges were slightly raised, like the tough linoleum had been momentarily melted or softened and then re-hardened. They looked exactly like what you'd expect to see if someone with incredible strength had dragged their fingernails across the floor. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a delusion. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was physical. This was real. I stood up slowly, a wave of nausea washing over me. My mind was scrambling, trying to find a rational explanation. The wheels on a gurney? No, they're rubber. They don't leave marks like this. A piece of fallen equipment? No, the marks were too uniform, too organic. They looked like they were made by a hand. With a sense of creeping horror, I realized the scratches didn't just stop there. There was another set about a foot ahead of the first, and another one after that. It was a trail. Someone, or something, had dragged itself out of that room. Or been dragged. I had to know where it went. I don't know why. Maybe it was the nurse in me needing to solve the problem, or maybe it was just a morbid, primal need to see the monster you know is hiding in the dark. I followed the trail. My flashlight was the only thing guiding me. The beam stayed locked on the floor, on that obscene set of tracks. Shush. Thunk. The sound replayed in my head, and now I understood it. It was the sound of a body being pulled across the floor. The shush was the drag. The thunk was the dead weight of a limb or a head hitting the ground. The trail led me down the entire length of the B-wing corridor. It didn't waver or change direction. It was purposeful. It passed the doors to other rooms where other patients slept, blissfully unaware. It passed the empty rec room with its silent television and neatly stacked board games. It continued past the junction that led back to the main lobby and the exit. It didn't go toward the exit. It went toward the dining hall. That didn't make any sense. The dining hall was a dead end at this time of night. The kitchen was locked, the lights were off, the main doors were always closed and latched. Why would anyone, or anything, go there? I reached the end of the hallway. The trail of 5-fingered scratches went right up to the base of the large, swinging double doors of the dining hall. And there, it stopped. The floor in front of the doors was a mess of these gouges, overlapping and angry, as if whatever made them had struggled there for a moment before passing through. I stood there, my light fixed on the last set of marks. The building was utterly silent again. No more dragging, no more thumps, just the low hum of the refrigerators from the kitchen beyond the doors. Both doors were closed. No, wait, not both. The right-hand door, the one with the little circular window, wasn't fully latched. It was open, just a crack, a sliver of perfect, complete blackness, no more than an inch wide. The trail led right to that crack. I held my breath, listening. My own heartbeat sounded like a drum in my ears. I took a half-step closer, straining to hear anything from the darkness beyond that door. A whimper, a footstep, anything. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just silence. I was about to dismiss it, to turn and run back to the station and call 911, to just get out. And then I heard it. It came from the blackness inside the dining hall. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a footstep. It was a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the most ancient, terrified part of my brain. It was a sniff. Not a quick sniff, like someone with a cold. It was a long, slow, wet, deliberate inhalation. A deep, rattling sound, like a massive hound tasting the air for a scent. SNNNNFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFF Just on the other side of that door. And as I stood there, frozen in the hallway, the flashlight beam shaking so badly it felt like a strobe light, I knew with a bone-deep, soul-shattering certainty that it had just caught my scent. My heart, my lungs, my entire nervous system just shut down. For a second that stretched into a small eternity, I wasn't there. I wasn't a nurse in a hallway. I was just a pair of eyes and ears, a recording device for the sound that had just slithered through that crack in the door. The sniff. That long, wet, impossibly deep inhalation. It wasn't just a sound, it was an event. It felt like the air pressure in the hallway had dropped, like that single sniff had pulled all the warmth, all the safety, all the sanity out of the space and into whatever was on the other side. And I knew, the way an animal knows when a predator is near, I knew it had my scent. It had been tracking its prey, the poor soul who left those gouges on the floor, and now it had a new signal. Me, fresh, alive. Terrified, my body finally came back online, but it didn't listen to the screaming part of my brain that was yelling, run. Instead, it betrayed me. It chose self-preservation in the quietest way possible. My feet, encased in their squeaky rubber-soled shoes, began to move. Backwards, one slow, agonizing shuffle at a time. I didn't turn around. I couldn't take my eyes off that sliver of absolute blackness in the dining hall door. I was convinced that the moment I looked away, the door would fly open and the thing that made that sound would be on me. So I backed away, like I was disarming a bomb with my eyes. My hand, slick with a cold sweat I hadn't even realized was there, gripped the heavy mag light so hard my knuckles burned. The flashlight beam quivered, dancing around the edges of the door. My breath was a prisoner in my chest. Each step backward was a negotiation with the floor, a silent plea for it not to creak, not to make a sound, not to announce my retreat. Shuffle, one step. The silence held. Shuffle, another step. The hum of the distant ice machine was the only sound in the world. I made it 5 feet. 10. I was halfway back down the B-wing corridor, moving like a crab, my head twisted over my shoulder to keep that door in my sight. I had one goal. Get back to the nurse's station. Get to the phone. The phone was safety. The phone was the outside world. The phone was a lifeline to people who didn't know about long, wet sniffs in the dark. And that's when the lights flickered. It wasn't a gentle flicker. It was a violent, stuttering spasm. The long fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed like angry hornets, flashing on and off, turning the hallway into a strobing, disorienting nightmare. In the brief flashes of light, I saw the empty hallway. In the flashes of darkness, I saw the gouges on the floor burn themselves into my retinas. Then, with a final, electrical pop and a sigh of dying capacitors, the whole corridor went dark. No, not dark. The world didn't go black. It went red. The emergency lights kicked in. A series of small, dome-shaped bulbs embedded in the walls, maybe every 20 feet, casting a weak, hellish, crimson glow over everything. The beige walls were now the color of dried blood. The polished floor reflected the red light like a pool of black water with a bloody film on top. The silence that followed the death of the main lights was profound. It felt thick, heavy. You could drown in it. And into that thick, red silence, a new sound erupted. BRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr polite chime it had been before. It was the call button from room 204, shrieking with no pause, no rhythm. It sounded like someone wasn't just pressing the button, but leaning on it with their entire body, trying to push it through the wall with the sheer force of their terror. My blood turned to ice. My neatly laid out plan, get to the phone, call for help, evaporated. My job and my life were now in two completely opposite directions. Behind me, down the hall towards the nurse's station, was a potential escape. Ahead of me, back towards the dining hall and deeper into the red-lit darkness, was a patient who was in the throes of a terror I was beginning to understand all too well. For a split second, I considered just running. To hell with the job. To hell with Mrs. Adeline. No one would blame me. But the sound of that bell was the sound of pure, helpless fear. It was the sound of someone who knew the thing that sniffed in the dark was coming for them. How could I leave her to face that alone? Damn it, I whispered, the words a wisp of steam in the cold, red air. The nurse in me won. Professional duty, that stupid, ingrained need to help, took the controls. I fumbled with the mag light in my sweaty hand, my thumb finding the switch. Nothing. I clicked it again. Come on, you piece of junk, I hissed, shaking it violently. On the fourth click, it sputtered to life, a clean, powerful beam of white light that felt like a holy relic in this red-tinged hell. I ran. My sneakers, which had been so careful just moments before, now slapped against the linoleum. The beam of the flashlight bounced wildly ahead of me, a frantic circle of sanity cutting through the infernal glow. The bell from 204 was my beacon, a siren's call pulling me towards the danger. I burst into the room. The sight that greeted me was worse than I could have imagined. Mrs. Adeline wasn't screaming or crying. She was beyond that. She was huddled into a tight ball at the very top of her bed, pressed so hard against the headboard it looked like she was trying to merge with it. Her eyes, those same eyes that had looked so lucid and sharp earlier, were now stretched wide, the whites of them stark against the crimson gloom of the room. Her mouth was a tight, grim line. She wasn't making a sound, just letting the alarm bell scream for her. Her whole body was shaking with a violence that didn't seem possible for a woman her age. And she was pointing. Her thin, frail arm was extended, her index finger trembling but aimed with an unshakable, absolute certainty towards the window. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an accusation. Mrs. Adeline? I said, my voice cracking. It's okay, I'm here. She didn't even register my presence. Her eyes were locked on that window, her finger a silent testament to the horror she was witnessing. I took a step closer, my own heart hammering a rhythm that was a frantic counterpoint to the alarm bell. What could she possibly be seeing? We were on the first floor, sure, but there was nothing out there but a manicured lawn and a parking lot 100 feet away. My training told me to soothe her, to tell her it was a nightmare. But the raw, primal terror radiating from her was too real. It was contagious. Against my better judgment, against every fiber of self-preservation that was still functioning in my body, I followed her shaking finger. I swept the beam of the mag light towards the window. At first, there was nothing. Just the black pane of glass reflecting the chaotic red interior of the room, my own terrified face a ghostly mask in the center of the light. See? I almost said, there's nothing there, it was just a dream. And then it moved, my breath hitched, my entire world narrowed to that bouncing circle of light. It wasn't a reflection, it was outside. For a sliver of a second, the flashlight beam caught it. It was a figure, Tall, impossibly tall and thin, like a charcoal sketch of a man stretched to a breaking point. It was dressed in what looked like dark, tattered clothes, but its shape was all wrong. The joints seemed to be in the wrong places, the limbs too long, the angles too sharp. It moved with a twitching, puppet-like grace that was utterly inhuman. It didn't walk or run. It glided past the window, its head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. It was there for a single heartbeat, a silhouette of disjointed wrongness against the distant sodium lamps of the parking lot. I saw no face. I saw no features. I only saw that lurching, broken stick movement as it slid past the window and was swallowed by the night. And the most terrifying part, the detail that my brain just couldn't process, was that its feet were level with the windowsill. On the first floor, there was no ledge out there. There was nothing to stand on. There was a 10-foot drop to the grass below. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a delusion. My mind, which had been so desperately trying to build a wall of logic against the night's events, just shattered. The scratch marks, the sniff, and now this impossible thing. It was real. This was happening. In the exact same instant that the figure vanished from my sight, the piercing shriek of the call button from the wall next to Mrs. Adeline's bed abruptly cut out. The silence that rushed in was more terrifying than the alarm had been. It was absolute, complete. The low hum of the emergency lights was now deafening. Mrs. Adeline let out a tiny, choked whimper, her arm falling limp to her side. The show was over. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight beam still fixed on the empty window, my knuckles white. It was gone. It had passed by. Maybe it was leaving. Maybe. Scrape. The sound was low, and it came from right outside the door to the room. Our door. It wasn't the frantic scratching of an animal trying to get in. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of fingernails, 5 of them, I just knew it, being dragged with immense pressure down the thick wood of the door. A long, groaning complaint of tortured wood. It hadn't left. It hadn't passed by. It had seen us in the window. It had come for her. It knew we were in here. And it was right outside the door. My brain went completely blank. For a second, all the training, all the logic, just vanished. There was only the sound. That slow, deliberate scrape of fingernails dragging down the wood of the door. It wasn't the sound of an attack. It was the sound of ownership. It was the sound of something marking its territory, and we were in it. Mrs. Adeline let out a sound, a little hiccup of air, like a kitten's cry. She knew what was out there. That was the thing from her corner. The thing she'd been watching. The thing she'd worried was hungry. A part of my brain, the part that was still a nurse, screamed at me. Protect your patient, stand your ground, barricade the door, but that part was very, very small. The much larger part, the animal part that had been cowering in my gut all night, was now in full control. And its message was much simpler. Live. I looked at the door, then at the terrified old woman in the bed, then back at the door. Her terror fed mine, and my terror, I'm sure, did nothing for her. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a silence that was 1,000 times worse. A listening silence. It knows we're in here. That was the only thought I had. It wasn't a guess. It was a fact. It had seen us in the window, a little tableau of red-lit fear, and it had come to the door. My hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the doorknob. The metal was cold. I didn't push it open. I pulled it shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that felt like a betrayal. I twisted the lock. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy, final thunk. I had just locked the helpless old woman in a room with the sound of her own private monster scratching at the door. I didn't even look back at her. I couldn't. I was a coward, and I didn't want to see the accusation in her eyes. I just wanted to be gone. I turned and ran. My feet, which had been so careful just minutes ago, now slapped against the linoleum floor, echoing in the blood-red corridor. The beam of my maglite bounced wildly, a frantic circle of white light in this hellish glow. My only thought was the nurse's station, the phone, the solid core door, safety, and then I heard it behind me. It wasn't footsteps, not human footsteps, anyway. It was that sound from before, the one I'd heard from down the hall. A wet, uneven, slapping sound. Slap, scrape, slap, scrape. It was mixed with a dry, clicking noise, like a bag of broken twigs being dragged across the floor. It was faster now, much faster. It wasn't shuffling anymore. It was pursuing. My lungs burned. My breath came in ragged, panicked sobs. The nurse's station felt a mile away. The red emergency lights seemed to stretch the hallway into an infinite, bloody tunnel. The slapping sound got closer. Slap, scrape, click. Slap, scrape, click. It was gaining on me. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes. I wasn't going to make it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The thing behind me was too fast. The nurse's station was too far. The door to the station had a keypad, and in my panic, my fumbling fingers would never get the code right in time. I'd be caught right there, my back to it, a perfect target. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for an alternative. And there it was, on my left. The double doors to the main dining hall. Not ideal. It was a big, open space. But the doors were heavy. They had push bars on the inside. Maybe I could lock them. Maybe I could hide. It was closer. It was my only chance. I didn't slow down. I veered left, my shoulder hitting the push bar with all my weight. The door flew open with a groan and I scrambled inside, a wild animal diving for cover. I spun around, grabbing the cold metal of the second door and pulling it shut. The heavy doors clicked closed, muffling the slap scrape click from the hallway. I fumbled along the edge of the nearest door in the near total darkness, my fingers searching for a lock. My maglite beam danced frantically over the metal. There was no deadbolt, no sliding lock. Of course not. It was a public space. They were designed to be opened from the inside during an emergency. I let out a choked sob of frustration. I'd trapped myself. The dining hall was a cavern of shadows, punctuated by the faint, eerie red glow filtering through the small square windows in the doors. I could see the outlines of tables and chairs, arranged like silent, skeletal observers. The air was cold and smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. My only option now was to hide. My light swept across the room and landed on the serving line, a long counter of stainless steel. It was my best bet. I clicked off the maglite, plunging the room into near blackness. The sudden darkness was disorienting, but I knew I couldn't risk the light. I moved as quietly as I could, my feet clumsy, my breath a prisoner in my chest. I rounded the end of the counter and crouched down, pressing my back against the cold, unyielding metal. I was completely hidden from the doors. My heart was a drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it from the hallway. I tried to control my breathing, taking shallow sips of air through my nose, fighting the urge to gasp. I made myself as small as possible, tucking my knees to my chest. And I waited. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 10, 30, maybe it had gone past. Maybe it was still focused on room 204. A sliver of hope, fragile and stupid, began to form in my mind. Maybe I was safe. Click. It wasn't a loud sound. It came from the main doors. It was the sound of a locked tumbler, not on my side, but on the outside. A maintenance lock. I never even knew there was one. My blood ran cold. The sliver of hope didn't just break, it vaporized. The door didn't fly open. It swung inward with an agonizingly slow, deep groan of protesting hinges. A tall, impossibly thin slice of the red-lit hallway appeared, then widened. And then a figure stepped through. He had to duck to get through the doorway. That was the first thing my panicked brain registered. He was so tall, his head nearly scraped the top of the frame. And he was thin, not just skinny but skeletal, emaciated, like a famine victim stretched on a rack. He wore dark, tattered clothes that hung off his frame, and he moved with a horrifying, disjointed grace. His limbs were too long, his joints seemed to bend at odd, unnatural angles. As he straightened up inside the dining hall, there was a chorus of soft pops and dry crackles, like old bones settling into place. It was the sound I'd heard in the hall. It was him. His head was tilted to one side, held at an angle that looked painful, an angle that no living person would hold. He stood there for a long moment, a broken silhouette against the red glow from the corridor, as if getting his bearings. He didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular. He just stood. Please, I begged to whatever God might be listening. Please just go back to her room. Please don't know I'm here. He didn't move towards the hallway leading to the patient rooms. He took a slow, lurching step into the center of the dining hall, his long, stick-like legs bending incorrectly. He stopped between the silent tables. And then he did the thing that shattered the last of my composure. He inhaled. It was the same sound I'd heard from under the door. A long, wet, deep inhalation that seemed to pull all the air and warmth out of the room. It was an impossibly loud sound, raspy and resonant. He wasn't just breathing, he was tasting the air, Hunting. His head stayed tilted, but I could feel the intensity of his stillness. He was processing, a predator analyzing the scents. Disinfectant, stale coffee, and me, fresh, alive, terrified. He took another slow, crackling step. And another. He was moving past the serving counter. For a wild, insane second, I thought he was just going to walk right by, maybe towards the kitchen. He was moving so slowly, so deliberately. Then he stopped. He was directly parallel to my hiding spot. I could have reached out and touched his ragged pants if I'd had the courage. My entire body was a single, clenched muscle. I held my breath until my lungs screamed. I was convinced the thumping of my own heart was a beacon. He stood there, perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the low, electric hum of the emergency lights. And then, with a slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden movement, he began to turn his head. It didn't turn like a person's head. It rotated on his neck with a series of tiny, dry clicks, like a ratchet wrench, one agonizing notch at a time. The rest of his body remained perfectly, unnervingly still. I couldn't see his face at first, just the back of his matted hair. Then his cheekbone, sharp and pronounced under pale, tight skin. Then the corner of his mouth, a thin, colorless line. The rotation continued until his face was fully pointed in my direction. His eyes found me. He wasn't looking at the stainless steel counter. He was looking through it. Right at me. There was no question. His eyes were wide, and in the dim, red light, they looked completely white. Two milky, dead orbs set in a skeletal face. There was no pupil, no iris, just a flat, horrifying whiteness. And they were locked directly onto my own. He knew. He had known the second he'd stepped into the room. He didn't lunge. He didn't scream. A thin, slow smile stretched his lips, revealing pale, bloodless gums. He knew the chase was over. The game was won. He took a step towards the counter. One deliberate, lurching step. His knee joint popped with a sound like a firecracker. He took another. The sound of his bones was the only percussion in the silent room. He raised one long, spidery hand, the fingernails yellowed and overgrown, and rested it on the top of the steel counter, right above my head. His mouth opened, a dark O in his gaunt face. A voice, dry and raspy, like dead leaves scraping across pavement, whispered a single word into the cold air. Hungry. My mind was a white-hot static, a complete system failure. The word hung in the air between us, a physical thing. Hungry. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, a diagnosis. My entire world had shrunk to the space beneath this steel counter, to the two dead, milky eyes staring through the metal and into my soul. My lungs were stone, my blood was ice. I was prey, frozen in the predator's gaze, and the last sound I would ever hear was the dry pop of its joints as it moved to collect its meal. And then the world broke. WRAH. 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 The sound was so violent, so absolute, it wasn't even a noise. It was a physical force that slammed into me, shaking the steel counter, vibrating through my bones, and scouring the air clean of thought. For a split second, I thought it was the creature, that this was the sound it made when it finally attacked. But then the light came. Red strobes pulsed from the ceiling, one after another, bathing the cavernous dining hall in frantic, rhythmic flashes of bloody light. The fire alarm. It was in the opposite wing, the B wing, but it might as well have been inside my skull. The creature, which had been leaning over the counter with that awful, triumphant slowness, flinched. It was a full-body recoil, spastic and unnatural. The long, spider-like hand that had been resting on the steel above my head snapped back as if burned. Its head, still locked on me, twisted slightly, the smile vanishing, replaced by something that looked like irritation. Annoyance. The dry clicking sound from its neck intensified, faster now, a series of sharp, angry pops. It looked toward the doors, toward the source of the pulsing red light and the apocalyptic siren. It took a lurching step back from the counter, its white eyes blinking rapidly in the strobing light. It was disoriented. The sudden sensory assault had shattered its predatory calm. For a creature that thrived in silence and shadows, this was hell. It took another jerky step back, its head swiveling between the door and my hiding spot. In one flash of red light, its white eyes found mine again. And in that last, fleeting moment, there was no confusion. There was only a look of pure, undiluted malice. A promise, a rain check. Then, with a speed that defied its broken, lurching movements, it spun around. It didn't run, it flowed. It poured itself across the dining hall floor, a river of disjointed limbs and tattered cloth, and vanished through the fire exit at the back of the kitchen. The door swung shut behind it, cutting off its retreat into the night just as the heavy main doors I'd come through burst open. Hello? Security? Anybody in here? Two beams from heavy-duty flashlights cut through the strobing red darkness. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was still fused to the floor, my muscles locked. I could hear their heavy boots on the linoleum, their anxious voices calling out. One of the beams found me. It pinned me in my crouched position, a mess of tangled limbs and wild eyes. Jesus Christ, ma'am, are you okay? It was Arthur, the head of night security. A big guy, ex-military, usually had a calm demeanor that could soothe the most agitated patient. Right now, his face, illuminated by the red pulses and his own flashlight, was tight with alarm. I tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. My throat was sandpaper. I pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen exit. It went out there. Arthur and the other guard, a younger guy named Ben, exchanged a look. Who went out there, Lana? Arthur asked, his voice gentle but firm, the kind you use on a hysterical person. The man, I whispered. The tall man. Ben was already on his radio, his voice a clipped, professional counterpoint to the screaming alarm. We've got a possible intruder in the main dining hall. Sector A sending police. And for God's sake, somebody shut that damn alarm off. They helped me to my feet. My legs were like wet noodles. My whole body was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in my bones and worked its way out. They sat me down at one of the dining tables while Arthur went to check the back door. The alarm finally cut off, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. The red strobing lights stopped, replaced by the steady, sterile hum of the normal overhead fluorescence. The dining hall looked normal again, just tables and chairs and the lingering smell of disinfectant. If it weren't for the open fire exit, I would have thought I dreamed it all. Arthur came back, his face grim. Doors unlocked. No sign of anyone. You sure you saw someone, Lana? He was right here, I said, my voice cracking. He was tall, so thin. He whispered at me. I knew how it sounded. I sounded insane. The police came. 2 of them. They were calm, professional. They took my statement. I told them everything, from the first call from room 204 to the whisper of the word, hungry, over the counter. I described him as best I could. The skeletal frame, the weird, disjointed walk, the head tilted at an impossible angle, the clothes that looked like rags. The white eyes. I kept coming back to the white eyes. They listened patiently. They wrote it all down. But I could see it in their expressions. The polite skepticism, the shared glances, nurse on her first night shift, high-stress environment, an old lady with Alzheimer's planting ideas in her head. They found no signs of forced entry. The fire exit had been opened from the inside. They swept the perimeter with their flashlights and found nothing. No footprints in the soft earth outside. No broken branches. Nothing. The official theory started to form. A transient, maybe, someone mentally ill who'd slipped in when a door was propped open earlier in the day and had been hiding out. The alarm, which they learned was set off by another patient with dementia who'd wandered into an emergency exit in B Wing, probably spooked him and he fled. It was a neat, logical explanation that accounted for all the facts. All of them except the sound of his bones, the impossible angle of his neck, and the certain, predatory knowledge in his dead white eyes. They let me go home. My supervisor, Mrs. Gable, insisted. Take the day, Lana, she said, her hand on my shoulder. You've had one hell of a first night. Get some rest. I drove home as the sun was coming up, the sky turning from bruised purple to a soft, hopeful pink. The world looked obscenely normal. People were jogging. Cars were heading to work. It felt like a different universe from the red-lit nightmare of the dining hall. I got into my apartment, locked the door, slid the deadbolt, and leaned against it, finally letting out the sobs I'd been holding back all night. I replayed it over and over, the slow, ratcheting turn of his head. The impossible way his eyes found me. I was just a random nurse. It was a random encounter. That's what I told myself. It was random. I slept a dead, dreamless sleep for a few hours, then spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every creak of the floorboards in my own apartment. Around 4 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mrs. Gable. Lana, sorry to bother you at home, she said. Her voice was strained. Something's come up. It's about Mrs. Adeline. My stomach clenched. Is she okay? She's fine, dear. Same as always. But, well, this is odd. We were doing the morning chart audit, and her medical file is missing. From the nurse's station. We've looked everywhere. Missing? Just vanished. Look, I know you're off, but can you think of anything? Did you see anyone near the station last night before? Well, before everything happened? I told her no. The hallway had been empty. Eerily so. We hung up, and a new, colder kind of fear started to prickle at the edges of my exhaustion. It wasn't random. He was in the hall. He'd been near the station. An hour later, Mrs. Gable called back. Her voice was different now. Taut. Frightened. Lana, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus, one of the janitors, just found it. The chart? Yes. In the dumpster behind the kitchen. By the fire exit he ran out of. I didn't say anything. My blood had turned to slush in my veins. Lana, she continued, I think you need to come in. There's something inside it. I don't want to talk about it over the phone. The drive back to the nursing home was surreal. The building looked the same, bathing in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. But it felt different, tainted. Mrs. Gable met me in her office, a small, cluttered room that usually felt comforting. Today, it felt like a tomb. She closed the door behind us. On her desk, sitting starkly against the neat piles of paperwork, was Mrs. Adeline's chart. A simple manila folder. We called the police back, she said quietly. They're on their way, but I wanted you to see this first. I think you have a right to. She pushed the folder across the desk. My hand was trembling as I reached for it. I opened the cover. Inside were the usual medical records. Doctor's notes, medication logs, progress reports. But tucked between the pages were things that didn't belong. Scrawled in angry, red ink, in a messy, jagged handwriting, were notes in the margins. On a page detailing her Alzheimer's symptoms, a note said, "She sees me." My breath hitched. He was talking about Mrs. Adeline, the woman in the corner. I turned the page. A nurse's log from 2 days ago. Another red scrawl. It knows I'm hungry. He was calling himself it. He wasn't talking about his own hunger. He was talking about the entity's hunger. And Mrs. Adeline knew. She was trying to warn me. My fingers felt numb as I turned to the last page, the sheet where I had signed in my name for the night shift. There was another note. This one made my stomach drop into a cold, dark abyss. It said, "It calls the nurse for me." The bells, the frantic ringing. It wasn't Mrs. Adeline. It was him, using her button to summon me, luring me to the room. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what had made Mrs. Gable's voice tremble on the phone. Tucked into the back flap of the folder was a piece of paper. A square, greasy napkin, the kind you get from a cheap diner. It was crumpled, as if it had been in a pocket for a long time. Someone had flattened it out and drawn on it. With a shaking hand, I pulled it out. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn diagram, but I recognized it instantly. It was the nurse's station. There was the U-shaped counter, a little square for the computer monitor, another for the phone, a circle indicating the chair. My chair, the place where I had sat just last night, bored and tired, believing I was in the safest place in the world. And below the map, drawn in the same thick, red ink, was a single word. It was circled, twice. Lan. They'd gotten my name wrong. But it didn't matter. I stood there, staring at the napkin, the world falling away around me. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a car crash. The figure in the window, the scraping at the door, the pursuit down the hall. He wasn't just wandering. He wasn't just looking for any victim. He had come there for a reason. He had a plan. The meal Mrs. Adeline was so worried about. The dinner she asked if I had served to the shadow in her corner. It wasn't for him. It was me. I was the meal, and he was still out there, and he knew my name.